German novelist Heinrich Boll once described how people read the headlines and treat the main body of the article like the fine print in an insurance policy. I increasingly treat mainstream media articles like that, finding much more profit in the online comment sections instead of the official article. Think of this video as the video version of the comment section. The Overton Window, named after Joseph P. Overton, is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. Why is the Overton Window constantly moving left? Why is the Republican Party of 2021 more liberal than the Democratic Party of 1990? What are the forces behind this ceaseless shift toward progressivism and a drearily consistent dedication to downward aspiration? By downward aspiration, I mean, instead of aiming high, you imitate social behaviors that are lower than the ones that you grew up with. The suburban girl who suddenly develops a love of twerking, for instance, is an act of downward aspiration.
Have you ever seen a white girl twerk?
I ain't never seen a white girl twerk.
Do you want to see a white girl twerk?
Yeah, I want to see the white girl twerk.
The corn-fed middle American kid who larps as a rapper and speaks like a Mississippi sharecropper from 1889 would be another example.
That foo-foo lane shit, I ain't with it. Sending shots at your fitted. Swag, bitch.
We used to have upward aspiration, where people wanted to be classy. Now there seems to be a race to imitate the low IQ, the dysfunctional, the ghetto-bitten. Kids aren't encouraged to better themselves. They're encouraged to conform to gutter lifestyles and to imitate prison culture. My wife and I were watching old episodes of The Love Boat from the 1970s, and among all the people in bathing suits and bikinis, not a single tattoo appeared. Why? Because it was aspirational. It was supposed to evoke glamour. Try doing that same scene now with tramp stamps and prison tats. You'd be in a flood of post-pregnancy stretch marks and bullet scars on buttocks. Downward aspiration is the trend today. Why? I'd like to try to answer that with recourse to a peculiar scientific experiment from 1931. In it, an eccentric scientist named Withrop Niles Kellogg induced his wife to raise a baby chimp along with their child to see if they could socialize the chimp into behaving more like a human. In this Smithsonian Magazine article, we read, on June 26, 1931, comparative psychologist Withrop Niles Kellogg and his wife welcomed a new arrival home, not a human infant, but a baby chimpanzee. The couple planned to raise the chimp, Gua, alongside their own baby boy, Donald. As later described in the psychological record, the idea was to see how environment influenced development. Could a chimp grow up to behave like a human? Or even think it was a human? In the end, the experiment was cut short after only 9 months. Why? It wasn't the chimp altering his behavior to conform to the human child. It was the human child who was altering his behavior to act more like a chimp. What Kellogg didn't know in 1931, and what we didn't know until 1991, was that humans have things in their brains called mirroring neurons. Mirroring neurons are what's responsible for fostering imitation in babies so that they can learn from adults by copying them. These are hardwired into us and are associated with empathy. In Marco Iacoboni's book, Mirroring People, he recounts the discovery by the University of Parma in Italy of so-called mirroring neurons in the brain. This discovery came about when they were doing completely different experiments with macaques in the lab. Quite by accident, a macaque, whose brain was being monitored by electrodes, registered activity in the F4 and F5 regions of the brain when it watched a research assistant engaging in a particular physical movement. Though the monkey remained motionless, its brain reacted to the human, with activity lighting up in the very regions associated with those movements in the monkey itself. This was the discovery of what are now known as mirror neurons. Behavioral coding was carried out in the brain, and imitative conduct seemingly hardwired in the animal. In other words, mammals are programmed to react to the behaviors of others around them. In Daniel Goleman's book, Social Intelligence, he writes about mirroring neurons and their role in empathy. He cites the work of Stephanie Preston and Franz de Waal. He writes, Preston pioneered using the methods of social neuroscience to study empathy in humans, and de Waal, director of Living Links at the Yerkes Primate Center, has for decades drawn lessons for human behavior from systematic observations of primates. Preston and de Waal argue that in a moment of empathy, both our emotions and our thoughts are primed along the same lines as those of the other person. Hearing a frightened cry from someone else, we spontaneously think what might be causing their fear. From a cognitive perspective, we share a mental representation, a set of images, associations, and thoughts about their predicament. The movement from empathy to act traverses mirror neurons. The more mirroring neurons you have, the more you can vicariously feel someone else's pain, or anxiety, or joy. Sociopaths and people with autism have stunted neurophysiological development and fewer mirroring neurons. They're incapable of creating a rapport with others around them. For instance, if you yawn, they won't reflexively yawn in response as most normal people do. The more advanced a brain is, the more mirroring neurons it has. It's associated with better social organization and ethical behavior. But there's a catch. What happens when an empathetic person comes into contact with, say, a chimp? The human, who has vastly more mirroring neurons, will start trying to communicate with the animal, and since the animal can't communicate up, the human will start to communicate down. He will shift his behavior because he simply has more neuroplasticity. It's why Kellogg's son imitated the chimp, and not vice versa. It was actually a sign of higher brain development, but it acted as an Achilles heel when you place the toddler into proximity with a lower life form. Likewise, when an empathetic human being comes into contact with a sociopath, the sociopath doesn't have the neurological capacity to link up with the normal person, so the normal person trying to meet him halfway will alter his behavior to try to establish a rapport with the sociopath, thus taking on more traits of the sociopath. This is why Euripides said, and it's quoted in the Bible, bad associations spoil useful habits. In other words, if you hang around bad people, you run the risk of psychological contagion. See, the sociopath is incapable of meeting the normal person halfway, so the movement only happens in one direction. Now here's the lesson to be drawn. Conservatives, who are kinder, more generous people given to doing more in their community and giving more to charity, try to conciliate the radical left. They think that if they give in to meet them halfway, the radical leftist will reciprocate, but they don't. You gave in on gay marriage under the assumption that the sociopath would help you achieve a secure border. You adopted his position, but he never adopted yours. You gave in and adopted his concepts of hate speech and everything being racist under the assumption that he'd be a little more amenable to helping you with the Second Amendment. He didn't. You gave in on tearing down the Confederate statues under the assumption that he'd leave statues of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson in place. Not a chance. See, sociopaths don't have the capacity to empathize with you. They don't have the ability to see things from your point of view. You do of theirs, but they can't reciprocate, and they don't. So you denounce violence in all its forms, as they burn down your cities. In short, you're trying to bargain with a sociopath. And I say sociopath because, let's face it, people who would hurt and sexualize children are sociopaths. People who would try to normalize pedophilia are sociopaths. People who would legalize the purposeful transmission of AIDS are sociopaths. And these are the people you're trying to bargain with. It's worse than banging your head up against a wall. It's trying to make a deal with the chimp. You have empathy. He doesn't. You have neuroplasticity. Him, not so much. So the change happens all in one direction. Stop it. Stop this fruitless masochism, this ceaseless sliding of the Overton window left. And left is the operative word. Because if you keep going on like this, your society will collapse, and you will have nothing left. People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming. And don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.